Yes, thanks for the introduction. I think I might have written that when I joined Westpac. I'm the only industry economist at Westpac. I sit within the economics team. I'm the microeconomist. The rest of the team, and there's 5 of us, are macroeconomists, and I report directly to Dominic Stevens. So I get to look at quite a few industries, and in that respect, I suppose I'm a jack of all trade, master of none. Just to give you an idea, since I've wrote a report on the forestry industry about 9 months ago, I've since looked at the wine industry, which was really good, especially when it came down to the investigation side. Accounting was, of course, a little bit dry and a little bit dull in some respects, and my most recent report is on the rental and leasing industry, which is a very interesting industry in itself. So I cover a wide range, and I always know when I come to these kind of events that I'm sitting in front of people that basically got 30, 40 years of experience, and I'm acutely aware of that. Nevertheless, I did think I would talk a little bit about what came out of that report, and I've updated some of it with the data that's been available, and I'd like to go through some of that. And when I look at presentations, and when I do presentations, I tend to look at it in very much a structural sense, and that's just because I'm not very imaginative. So I like to use a particular structure, and essentially what I like to do is I like to dimension the industry and say, well, this is what the size of the industry is, this is what the shape of the industry is, what are the factors that drive demand for product, in other words, wood, and that could be logs, it could be processed wood. What are the factors that drive the supply of that wood into the market, again, of different varieties and different levels of beneficiation. Once I understand the supply drivers and the demand drivers, what's the basis of competition? So how do firms actually compete with each other? And there, I think, is where I'll talk a little bit about some of the competitiveness issues. Normally when I did this presentation, it was quite long, and I used to have lots and lots and lots of slides. I've really trimmed it down, and maybe I've trimmed it down too far, I'm not sure. But I'll then go on to talk a little bit about what I think the short-term outlook is and what I think the long to medium-term outlook is. So at the end of the presentation, you might not be clapping, but be that as it may, we'll see. So let me start. And normally when I talk about size and dimensions, I'm talking about, how big it is, how much is produced, and basically how many firms there are, and basically what's the degree of concentration in the industry. But for a presentation such as this, which is squeezed within a relatively short time frame, I'm unable to do that. Otherwise, I could hide myself behind a whole lot of slides. But I will talk. Where do I squeeze? Oh, there we go. And I really summarised, and I crunched about 5 slides into one. And I mean, the reality is the log process, and this talks about the whole value chain. This is a big industry, and it's a really important industry, and I'm sure most of you know that. You've got about 6.3 billion, and these figures, incidentally, are 2018 numbers. 6.3 billion. Most of that comes out of logs. Some of it's processed wood, and it's a big contributor to the economy. So I refer to it as net output, which contribution to gross domestic product, which essentially is sales minus cost of sales, or gross output minus intermediate consumption, but that gets really technical. And it amounts to about 3.6 billion, 1.7% of GDP, which is significant for any industry in New Zealand. So it's big. If I remember correctly, exports were basically the 4th largest export commodity. So behind dairy, meat, and I can't remember what the other one was, but I'm sure there was one. So it is significant. The other little aspects on there really talk about, the forestry industry, how much it covers, how many forestry owners there are out there, and there are a hell of a lot. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them basically are farmers. And I haven't included there who the forestry managers, and some of those forestry managers, of course, are forestry owners. And some of those are really big, and some of those are really small, and perhaps less than scrupulous. And then, of course, you've got your contracting crews that basically process the logs and get them off to wherever they're going to go, either domestically or internationally. I've got on there an estimate for wood processors, and I must be honest, when I did the report, and I know there's a lot of data available, but there's also data that's not available, and one of those was basically how many are there, and I really, really struggled to find this. And essentially, came up with the idea that it was about 400 firms, and I did a lot of cross-checking on that, and about 280 sawmilling firms. And I thought, well, how can that be? Because I know there's only basically about 40-odd sawmilling plants, but that also includes all these one-man shops and basically portable mills and that kind of thing, sit on the back of a ute. Those kind of firms. So yes, I could easily make a case for 280 sawmilling firms. And of course, it's a big employer, and the banking industry, which I'm a part of, basically employs about 20-odd thousand people. So it's a similar size in terms of the number of people employed. So it's a big industry all round, and as I said, indirectly through ripple effects through the economy, it's about 100,000. So that gives you a kind of idea of shape, and I've really condensed that. And normally I take about 20 minutes to discuss that, but I've done it in about 3. It's big. The next slide really talks about big in terms of production volume. So I tend to show this slide basically, and this wasn't in the report. I just basically extracted it and recreated this slide, and I think it tells where the logs actually go. So about 2/3 of logs, and when we talk about logs, we're talking about in cubic meters, million cubic meters, and about 2/3 of that go to export straight out the door. And about 1/3 goes to domestic processing. And then within domestic processing, the big one, of course, is sawn timber, and basically going through the timber mills, and wood panels and pulp and paper are considerably less. And also, it's also true to say that wood processing sector exports quite a lot, but actually also supplies this domestic market. In fact, in sawn timber, we're talking about 2.6 million cubic meters, and so about 2/3, and then 1.8 goes into exports. So it's a big industry, and there's a lot of processing that happens, but that's small, about 1/3 of what is exported, and that really shows a snapshot of almost the characteristics of the industry, and almost in some ways the structure of the industry. This next slide gives you kind of a longitudinal look, which I always like because I'm an economist, so I like time series. And the red line basically refers to the red box in the previous at the top line, and that shows you basically that export logs have gone through the roof, and considerably so. And you contrast that to what's happened to log production and to local sawmills, and you can see it's effectively flatlined. It hasn't gone anywhere. So much so that this gap now is starting to open, and it's opening quite considerably. And I would point out something. But having said that, sawmilling has increased slightly, and I will talk about some of the factors that have driven that. Now, I'm going to try this laser thingy, so I might get this wrong, but what was interesting to me was, as you saw this decline here in export logs, you actually saw basically a slight pickup thereafter, almost a lag pickup in sawmilling. Sorry, I'm not very good at this. I'm going to flick this into the next building. This pickup here, this is declining. You get a pickup in local domestic, and then when you've got this little drop here, you would expect to see this little pickup here. So it does respond, and I will talk about a little bit about that in future slides. But I thought this was quite an interesting slide to show, and essentially what it means is that logs going into sawmills are increasing, but only slightly. But the real action is really on the export side, and that action is really in China. Now, I would have liked to have had the 2008 export numbers, but I don't. But be that as it may, I think the picture, the graph tells a thousand words, I think, or tells a story, and we can see that basically the black bars are dominating the bar chart. And South Korea is pretty big as well, but it's all about China. So what is the forestry and wood processing industry? If I was going to summarize it, it's all about exports, and it's all about China. And that, is just a reality of where we are. So where is it going in China, and what is driving that demand? Well, there are quite a few reasons why we're going into China, and I will talk about, I think I came over about 4 of them. First of all, we've got China growing at about 6%. It was growing at 12%. Its growth is slightly reduced. 6% growth is still substantial. You've got rapid urban migration. You've got rising income levels. You've got new house builds, and that's really pushing that bar effectively, but you've also got the fact that their sawmillers are subsidised, and perhaps unfairly subsidised, so much so that they can actually come into our market and offer forestry owners prices that can't be matched by local sawmillers. And that's even for logs that perhaps are of a lesser quality. And under those circumstances, it's no surprise that forestry owners are flogging their logs into that market. So if we have a look at that, and some of the charts that I have coming up really talk about some of those demand-side drivers, particularly in China. And the bars, the red bars, basically show year-on-year growth in log exports to China, and you can actually see that they've come off. So yes, while exports have grown, they are slowing, but they're still growing by over more than 5%, because it's actually on the left-hand axis here. At the same time, floor spaces, and part of that, the reason for that is residential building activity has grown, but is growing at a slower pace. So that's a key driver for basically log demand into China. The second of all, and I always put this up as really economic performance, and it's just a generic term, and it talks about GDP per capita in China, and the fact that that's slowed considerably, and you would expect that. Population growth is pretty slow, but actually as the economy has slowed down, obviously GDP per capita has slowed down as well, and that's also bears some kind of relationship with log exports into China. So that's I suppose all I really wanted to say on the demand-side drivers, and as I said, I'm really going through this quite fast, but it does tell you a story that we produce lots of logs. They're really good quality for what China is looking for. They've got the money, and on their demand side, they've got residential building activity and a strong economy basically pushing that demand. Having said that, though, log export growth is slowing, in part because China is slowing. And the other reason, which I didn't talk about, was on the supply side. And one of the reasons why our log industry or forestry industry has been so successful is because effectively Russia's moved upstream into wood processing and is selling into the Chinese market, but processed wood, and we've basically taken up the gap. So the forestry industry, and it's taken, and you can actually see that. So, and it's quite plain. In part, I realise that Russia basically does have a couple of issues with productive capacity and a number of challenges that it faces. But clearly we've taken up that gap that basically China has vacated. It still hasn't vacated totally because it's still selling wood into the market, but certainly, or selling logs into that market, but certainly. It's selling a lot less than it used to. So that's an important consideration. I won't talk about the other countries that are on there. That's all I really wanted to say about logs, and normally I have about a whole lot more slides, but I did want to talk about domestic processing. So the log side looks pretty good. It's growing, but it's growing at a slowing rate, and it's slowing because China's slowing. But if we looked at domestic processing, and what this chart shows, I've taken the production numbers and I've indexed them back to 2003, and then had a look at those over a period of time. And what it tells me is basically when you look at most areas of domestic production, they are in decline, and they have been in decline for quite a long time. The only exception I would say to that is probably sawmilling or sawn timber, which still seems to be, and this is domestic processing of saw timber. So since about 2009, it's generally increased, or gradually increased, probably a better way of putting it, albeit at a much slower rate than log exports. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I'll go into those just now. But I think this gives you a good idea. Most areas of domestic processing are on decline, but not so sawn timber. And the main reason for that, or one of the key reasons for that, is because construction activity in New Zealand has been relatively strong. And this chart basically shows you residential building consents, which is intent to construct, and we've done a year-on-year percentage change, and we've matched that against apparent consumption of sawn timber. So effectively, a large chunk of that processed sawn timber is going into residential building, basically, and that's been growing. So that's been a steady market. but it's really basically dominating that market, and it's well stocked. One of the other drivers, and one of the things I like to show, and I had, as I said, a couple of other slides that I might have shown, is the fact that one of the reasons why some areas of production have declined is because of issues like technology. So we looked at pulp and paper production has declined, and I then took that and said, well, let's have a look at the internet, and let's have a look at how technology advanced, and it's really difficult to get those kind of figures, but broadband consumption, as you can see, is that dotted line, and I can only go back to 2011, but it's got this massive big increase. But at the same time, per capita consumption of paper has fallen, and this is in New Zealand, and it's fallen quite considerably from well over 230 tonnes per capita to less than 170, about 165, and that's quite considerable. Now, not all paper has declined. It's mainly in basically newsprint, magazine paper, and office paper. I have another slide that shows that basically if you look at packaging papers have actually accelerated dramatically. But the question is how much packaging paper we produce. And but if you look globally, the growth has certainly been there. If we then look at processed wood exports, and I do apologise because we don't have the 2008 numbers, while we've seen an increase in sawn milling, we've actually seen no real increase in sawn timber exports, and it's kind of gone flatline for the last couple of years. A little bit of a pickup here and there, and part of that is because we sell most of our sawn timber into Australia, and construction activity in Australia was relatively strong, and of course has come off more recently. Wood pulp has taken off, but that's going into Japan and for further processing into paper. But the other areas of processed wood exports have certainly declined. So we've got this idea that basically sawn timber basically has increased in terms of production, but exports have basically flatlined, and they're all going into the domestic market to feed the housing and construction sector in general. So what does this mean then for competitiveness? And I've got some rather sharp points in this presentation, and I will raise them, and they might not go down too well. But effectively we have a local dependency on the local market, and that's well saturated with timber that's produced, processed wood that's produced locally. But at the same time, if you had a look at the shape of the downstream processes, they tend to be small scale, and I realise there are some exceptions to the rule, and it tends to be fragmented, and it tends to have latent capacity or capacity at lower levels or not lower levels. There's a little bit of slack in the system. Maybe that's the right way of putting it. And my point about this industry, and I suppose it's the key point of this presentation, is that effectively you have an industry, and it's not unique, and you see this in other countries as well, which I've looked at this particular industry, is you've got upstream advantages in logs, and they get eroded as further you get downstream. Now, I looked at this industry in South Africa, and it was a pulp and paper industry, and exactly the same thing. They can grow trees at 15 years just like us. I realise the average rotation periods are slightly higher than that, but they can do it just as fast as us. But they've got smaller pulp and paper machines, so they produce at higher costs, and then they lose competitive down the value chain. I think the same happens here. We lose competitiveness down the value chain, partly because of the small scale of downstream wood processing, which has really catered for domestic requirements historically, and because it's fragmented. We can sometimes pick up a little bit on the currency, especially if it weakens, but essentially that effectively is my central point. How do you fix that? Well, you've got to invest. You've got to have economies of scale. You've got to push volume over fixed infrastructure or fixed cost, but that requires huge investment. It also requires some consolidation, and I do know there has been quite a bit of consolidation in the sawmilling, but more needs to be had, and possibly some clustering of activity to make sure that basically the processing activity is close to the source of the material, which I know in a lot of cases it is, but there are agglomeration benefits to be had and linkages into the ports. Because really at the end of the day, for wood processors, it's all going to be about exports, because the local market is only going to provide so much growth, and that's about it. The other points in there, the other point is that even if we do invest and we do get those economies of scale in the wood processing industry, and it does become competitive, you're still up against countries and firms and operating countries that are well entrenched, that are large volume producers, and it's going to be really difficult to take them on. But it is possible, and it would, but that would take time. The last 2 points on that slide are really things that I put in there, is the fact that, our exports at the moment are really dominated by Australia, and what happens in Australia counts. And we did a little calculation and said to us, what happens if the building industry in Australia goes down the tubes? And we saw that, I can't remember the exact figures, I think it was about 800 million of our exports would be affected, and that's not just wood products, but a lot of it was wood products. Would be affected, and so what happened in Australia counts, and we need to basically broaden and deepen that. Of course, we're selling into China as well, but for slightly different reasons. So really quick look at this industry. I tend to, when we do the outlook, tend to basically look at short-term first, and then the long-term afterwards. But this time I've switched it around, and partly because I think this tells a more structural type of story. So global demand for wood products, we think that it's a no-brainer. Global economies are growing. We're growing by 3%. Yes, there are fears right now about the global economy, but structurally, more people, growing global economies will always provide demand for wood, particularly forestry. We think New Zealand's going to continue its focus on logs. We don't think that's going to shift, and that's where it's got its advantage. It produces them cheaper than anybody else, produces them quicker, and it's got a lot of it. And I can't, if I was an owner or farmer or owned a forest, that's where I would be. And of course, the age profile of forest means more harvesting. That said, there should be investment in downstream processing, but that will be focusing on developing scale. Fewer sawmillers, much bigger firms, much bigger plants, bigger volumes, new technology, but that requires large-scale investment, and importantly, new products. And I did see over there basically a whole set of products, CLT and I think it was LVL, but there were a couple of other products basically coming on, which basically creates areas and niche areas that downstream processing could possibly exploit. Having said that, longer term, I think the prognosis is that wood processing is likely to experience sluggish growth, partly because it depends on the local market. When we talk about wood processing, we're talking about New Zealand, partly because it depends on what happens in New Zealand, and it has to exploit those opportunities in export markets, which it will struggle to do. In the near term, which isn't a particularly positive outlook, we're pretty... In the report that I wrote last year, really, I was quite negative about the possibilities for this year. Kind of reevaluated on that. But we do think the growth in China, growth in Chinese demand is set to slow. We're growing at 6% in China. It's probably like to say about 6%, but there's a whole number of factors at play that might impact on Chinese demand. Output gains because of trade uncertainties. But we think that supply, so there's likely to be more supply coming on the market. Demand's likely to be depressed because of a slowdown in global economic growth. China basically likely to slow, means that log prices are likely to weaken. So in the short term, we're not as positive for the forestry industry. Having said that, though, and after last week's announcement by the Reserve Bank that the MPS that they're looking to the next cut could be the next interest rate movement could be downwards, and we're predicting basically that interest rates will be cut next month. We think that the dollar will weaken in the short term, and we think that will boost forestry. I call it forestry gate incomes, but New Zealand returns, I suppose, which will be good news for upstream industry. Having said that, it all is not lost for the wood processing sector. We think there's still a little bit to run in the construction sector. Construction activity, particularly in Auckland, is significant. And if you look at the residential building consents in Auckland, they've been really strong. And that kind of suggests that in 2019, activity is going to be strong. And that will provide some support and some volume gains for wood processors going forward. It's not just in Auckland. Wellington itself has got some shortages it has to address. And, of course, Otago, being the tourism capital of New Zealand, and growing apace, and surrounding areas, particularly in Queenstown, should benefit accordingly. And that, I think, is essentially my little presentation. I think at the summary, and I've done it really fast and it took 20 minutes, I think that the real challenge for wood processors is this ability of scale, this lack of scale, and the fact that it has a historical legacy based on selling into the local market and relying on domestic manufacture, and to some extent the Australian market. It needs to basically wean itself off that. It needs to get bigger, needs to process more volumes, get into more export markets, and exploit those opportunities, as well as develop new products. There is opportunities in certain niches, and I'm sure firms will exploit those. Thank you.